Hello and welcome to Philobytes. In this video, we are going to talk about syllogistic rules and syllogistic fallacies. So let's begin. A syllogism may fail to establish its conclusion in many different ways. To help avoid common errors, 6 rules are set to guide the reasoners. So there are 6 syllogistic rules which we must abide by so that we don't end up making fallacies. So let's understand the rules one by one. The first rule is avoid 4 terms. A valid standard form categorical syllogism must contain exactly 3 terms, each of which is used in the same sense throughout the argument. In every categorical syllogism, the conclusion asserts a relationship between 2 terms, the subject, which is the minor term, and the predicate, which is the major term. Such a conclusion can be justified only if the premises assert the relationship of each of those 2 terms to the third term, that is the middle term. If the premises fail to do this consistently, the needed connection of the 2 terms in the conclusion cannot be established and the argument fails. So every categorical syllogism, in order to be valid, must involve 3 terms, no more and no less. If more than 3 terms are used, then the syllogism is invalid, and this fallacy is known as the fallacy of 4 terms. So what exactly is being said over here? Let us understand this with the help of an example. For example, if you want to establish a relation between, say, x and y. This is the conclusion you want to draw, that x and y are related. So let us understand, let us imagine that x and y is a man and a woman. For that, we introduce a third term, which is z. Now, if we say in the premises that X, the man, is the father of Z, and Y, the woman, is the mother of Z, then in the conclusion, we can say that X and Y are related as parents. They are husband and wife. Okay, so this is the function. This is how the middle term is used so that the 2 terms in the conclusion are related. The relation, in order to establish the relation between the minor term and the major term, we introduce a middle term, which is the third term, and in both the premises, the minor term and the major term must be related to the middle term in a proper way. The middle term should be same throughout in the 2 premises. It cannot be different. We cannot say X is related to Z in one place, and in the second premise we cannot say y is related to p, something like that. Okay, both the middle term has to be related to both the minor term and the major term in the same sense. Then only we can derive the conclusion that the minor term and the major term, that is S and P, are related with the help of N, which we find in the premises. Okay. Now, most often it is the middle term with 2 different meanings. Therefore, it is sometimes also known as the fallacy of the ambiguous middle. If, however, any other term is used ambiguously, then it is called the fallacy of 4 terms. It is not always that the middle term is used ambiguously with 2 different meanings. The other terms, that is the minor term and the major term, may also be used in a different way. So in that case, we will call it the fallacy of 4 terms. And if it is the middle term which is flawed, then we can say that it is the fallacy of the ambiguous middle. Let us understand this situation with these two examples. All men are rational animals. No women are men. No women are rational animals. And the other syllogism, the end of life is happiness. Death is the end of life. Therefore, death is happiness. In both these syllogisms, the middle terms, men and end of life, has been used in two different meanings. In the first case, the major premise, men, all men are rational. Here men is used inclusively as human beings. Okay, not as a man and woman, not in that sense. Here men means human beings, and it would refer to both male and females. But in the minor premise, we see men, this middle term has been used specifically in the exclusive sense as the opposite of women. So even though we find one word which is men as the middle term, it is ambiguous, because in the major premise it means one thing and in the minor premise it means something else. Similarly, here in the other syllogism, end of life, in the first major premise, we find the end of life is happiness. Here, end of life means purpose. Okay, the purpose of life is happiness. But in the minor premise, death is the end of life. Here, end of life means it is the literally the end, the last phase of life in that sense. So, end of life, even though it seems to be the same set of words, actually implies two different meanings. So here we have another case of ambiguous middle. Now rule number 2. Distribute the middle term in at least one premise. What does distribution mean? Distribution means when the proposition refers to all members of the class designated by that term. If the middle term is not distributed in at least one premise, the connection required by the conclusion cannot be made. So what underlies this rule is the need to link the major and the minor terms. If they are to be linked by the middle term, either the subject or the predicate of the conclusion must be related to the whole of the class designated by the middle term. That is, the whole class of the designated by the middle term means it must be distributed. It must refer to all members in at least one of the premises. If that is not so, it is possible that each of the terms in the conclusion may be connected to a different part of the middle term and not necessarily connected with each other. And if this rule is broken, that is, if the middle term is not distributed in any one of the premises, then the fallacy that is committed is known as the fallacy of the undistributed middle. Now let us solve some problems to clarify your understanding. This is problem number 2, which you will find in page number 240. All inventors are people who see new patterns in familiar things. So all inventors are eccentrics because all eccentrics are people who see new patterns in familiar things. What you are supposed to do over here is to construct the syllogism first. In order to construct the syllogism, first you have to find out the conclusion. The conclusion is all inventors are eccentrics. Therefore, eccentrics is the major term and it should go in the major premise. So the major premise will be all eccentrics are people who see new patterns in familiar things. Inventors naturally will be the minor term and it will go into the minor premise. So the minor premise will be all inventors are people who see new patterns in familiar things. Both the premises are A propositions. And if we remember, in A proposition, what is distributed? It is only the subject which is distributed. You can refer to the chart which I have included below, that in the proposition A proposition, which is which is quality is affirmative and it distributes only the subject. So in both the premises, what is happening is, in the major premise, the subject, eccentrics, is distributed. In the minor premise, the subject, inventors, is distributed. But is the middle term, which is people who see new patterns in familiar things, has it ever been distributed? No, it has not been distributed in both the premises. So because the middle term has not been distributed even once, therefore it commits the fallacy of undistributed middle. Okay. Rule number 3. Any term distributed in the conclusion must be distributed in the premises. To refer to all members of a class is to say more about that class than is said when only some of its members are referred to. Therefore, when the conclusion of a syllogism distributes a term that was undistributed in the premises, it says more about that term than the premises did. But a valid argument is one whose premises logically entail its conclusion, and for that to be true, the conclusion must not assert any more than what is already asserted in the premises. A term that is distributed in the conclusion but is not distributed in the premises is therefore a sure mark that the conclusion has gone beyond its premises and has reached too far, therefore it is invalid. And this fallacy is called the fallacy of illicit process. So what are the terms which constitute the conclusion? The minor term and the major term. So if the minor term is distributed, it means it is talking about all members. So if it is talking about all members in the conclusion, then it must also talk about all members in one of the premises. Otherwise, you cannot derive such a conclusion. Similarly, if the major term is distributed in the conclusion, it means it is talking about all members about the major term. So, in the premises, it must also refer to all members of the major term. Otherwise, from that premise, which is not talking about all members, but only talking about some members, you cannot derive a valid conclusion about all members. Okay. So there are two forms of illicit processes because there are two terms in the conclusion. When the major term is undistributed in the major premise, it will be known as illicit major, and if the minor term is distributed in the conclusion but not distributed in the minor premise, it will be illicit minor. For example, some snakes are not dangerous animals, but all snakes are reptiles. Therefore, some dangerous animals are not reptiles. This is problem number 3 on page 240. So first, as usual, you have to construct the syllogism. The conclusion is some dangerous animals are not reptiles. So the major premise is all snakes are reptiles, and the minor premise is some snakes are not dangerous animals. The form is AOO3. Now, in the conclusion, which is some dangerous animals are not reptiles, this is an O proposition, and in O proposition what is distributed? Only the P, that is the predicate, which is the major term over here, and that is reptiles. So we have to ask ourselves that is reptiles, the major term, also distributed in the major premise? Let's find out. The major premise says all snakes are reptiles, and all snakes are reptiles is an A proposition. And in A proposition, what is distributed? Only the subject. And here the subject is snakes and not reptiles. So we can say that the major term which is distributed in the conclusion is not distributed in the major premise. So it commits the fallacy of illicit major. Now here is another problem which exemplifies the fallacy of illicit minor. All opponents of basic economic and political changes are outspoken critics of the liberal leaders of Congress, and all right-wing extremists are opponents of basic economic and political changes. It follows that all outspoken critics of the liberal leaders of the Congress are right-wing extremists. This is problem number 5 on page 240. The form of the syllogism will be AAA4, and it reads like this. All right-wing extremists are opponents of basic economic and political changes. All opponents of basic economic and political changes are outspoken critics of the liberal leaders of the Congress. And the conclusion, therefore, all outspoken critics of the liberal leaders of the Congress are right-wing extremists. So what is the minor term over here? The minor term is just the outspoken critics of the liberal leaders of the Congress. So let's see if, and this is distributed over here because this is the subject, and the subject is always distributed in the A proposition. But is it also distributed in the minor premise? In the minor premise, all opponents of basic economic and political changes are outspoken critics of the liberal leaders of the Congress. So outspoken critics of the liberal leaders of the Congress, which is the minor term, has come into the predicate portion of the minor premise. As a result, it is not distributed because the minor premise is also an A proposition, and in A propositions only the subject is distributed, not the predicate. So here is an example where we find the fallacy of undistributed minor term, that is, it is committing the fallacy of illicit minor. Rule number 4. Avoid two negative premises. Any negative proposition, it can be universal or particular, that is E or O, denies class inclusion. It asserts that some or all of one class is excluded from the whole of the other class. Two premises asserting such an exclusion cannot yield the linkage that the conclusion asserts, and therefore cannot yield a valid argument. And this mistake is called the fallacy of exclusive premises. Now here is an example of the fallacy of exclusive premises. No writers of lewd, sensational articles are honest and decent citizens, but some journalists are not writers of lewd and sensational articles. Consequently, some journalists are honest and decent citizens. So the conclusion, that is, some journalists are honest and decent citizens, is a positive proposition. That is, it is a I proposition. But the premises are both negative. The major premise is E proposition, which says no writers of lewd and sensational articles are honest and decent citizens. And the minor premise is an O proposition, which says some journalists are not writers of lewd and sensational articles. So, from two negative premises, a positive conclusion cannot be drawn. So, this syllogism commits the fallacy of exclusive premises. Rule number 5. If either premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative. In the problem we just now solved, we have seen that the premises were negative, but the conclusion was positive. In other words, the premises were exclusive, but the conclusion was inclusive. So that cannot be the case. If the premises are negative, the conclusion must also be negative. And if the conclusion is positive or inclusive, then the premises must also be positive or inclusive. So if the conclusion is affirmative, that is, if it asserts that one of the two classes, S or P, is wholly or partly contained in the other, it can only be inferred from premises that assert the existence of a third class that contains the first and is itself contained in the second. However, class inclusion can be stated only by affirmative propositions. Therefore, an affirmative conclusion can follow validly from two affirmative premises. The mistake here, if we do not follow this rule, then the fallacy which is going to be committed is known as the fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise. Here is an example. This is problem number 1 on page 239. All chocolate eclairs are fattening foods because all chocolate eclairs are rich desserts and some fattening foods are not rich desserts. The conclusion is affirmative, which says all chocolate eclairs are fattening foods. But we see that the premise, the major premise, is not affirmative. It is a negative proposition. It is the O proposition, which says some fattening foods are not rich desserts. So if any one of the premises is negative, then the conclusion must also be negative. But in this syllogism, this rule is being broken. So affirmative conclusion has been derived from a negative premise. So here it is the fallacy has been committed and the rule has been broken. Rule number 6. From two universal premises, no particular conclusion may be drawn. So we have studied earlier in the Boolean interpretation of categorical proposition, the universal propositions, that is A and E, have no existential import, but particular propositions I and O do have existential import. So wherever the Boolean interpretation is supposed, a rule is needed that precludes passages from premises that have no existential import to a conclusion that have such an existential import. This final rule is not needed in the traditional Aristotelian account of the categorical syllogism because that traditional account paid no attention to the problem of existential import. However, when the existential import is carefully considered, it will be clear that if the premises of an argument do not assert the existence of anything at all, then the conclusion will be unwarranted from it. That is, if the premises are universal, it will be the case that the premises are not asserting the existence of anything at all. And if such is the case, then from those premises, we cannot draw a conclusion which asserts the existence of something. In other words, from universal premises which have no existential import, we cannot draw a conclusion which has existential import. So here is a problem which deals with the existential fallacy. Some foods that contain iron are toxic substances. For all fish containing mercury are foods that contain iron, and all fish containing mercury are toxic substances. The conclusion is some foods that contain iron are toxic substances. It is an I proposition, that is, it is particular, and I propositions are accepted as having existential import. But what are the premises? The premises are both universal A propositions. All fish containing mercury are toxic substances. All fish containing mercury are foods that contain iron. And these two A propositions, which are the premises, do not have existential import. So from premises which do not assert the existence of anything at all, we cannot draw a conclusion which does assert the existence of something. So here is the fallacy which is called the existential fallacy. So now we are familiar with all the 6 rules and the 6 corresponding fallacies concerning the syllogisms. Now let's complete the remaining problems which are given. This is problem number 7. All supporters of popular government are Democrats, so all supporters of popular government are opponents of the Republican Party in as much as all Democrats are opponents of the Republican Party. The conclusion is all supporters of popular government are opponents of the Republican Party. Therefore, the major premise will be all Democrats are opponents of the Republican Party, and the minor premise will be all supporters of popular government are Democrats. So in order to solve this problem and identify the rule which is being broken, let us understand step by step and ask ourselves these questions one by one. The first question is, does the argument have exactly 3 terms used consistently throughout? The answer is yes. You see the blue highlighted portion, that is opponents of the Republican Party, is the major term. The minor term is the red highlighted portion, which is supporters of popular government. And the middle term is the green highlighted word, which is Democrats. The next question is the middle term distributed at least once? Yes, the answer here also is yes, because in the major premise, the middle term appears in the subject position. That is, all Democrats are opponents of the Republican Party, and Democrats is the middle term. It is also the subject, and we know that in a proposition, the subject is distributed. So we can say that yes, the middle term is distributed at least once. The next question we have to ask ourselves is this. Is the major term distributed in the conclusion? The major term in the conclusion is opponents of the Republican Party, and obviously it is in the predicate position and it is not distributed because it is an A proposition. So the answer is no. So okay, if it is not distributed in the conclusion, is it distributed in the major premise? Let's see. No, it is also not distributed in the major premise. The major premise is all Democrats are opponents of the Republican Party. The major term, which is opponents of the Republican Party, appears in the predicate position once again in the A proposition, which is also the major premise. Therefore, it has not been distributed in the major premise. Hence, we can say that this syllogism commits the fallacy of illicit major, and the form of this invalid syllogism is AAA1. Problem number 8. No coal tar derivatives are nourishing foods because all artificial dyes are coal tar derivatives and no artificial dyes are nourishing foods. The conclusion of this syllogism is no coal tar derivatives are nourishing foods. The major premise is no artificial dyes are nourishing foods. And the minor premise is all artificial dyes are coal tar derivatives. The minor term that appears in the conclusion is coal tar derivatives. And in the conclusion, which is an E proposition, it is distributed. In E proposition, both subject and predicate terms are distributed. So is it distributed in the minor premise? The minor premise is all artificial dyes are coal tar derivatives. You see, it is an A proposition, and in the A proposition, the minor term appears in the predicate position. Hence, it is not distributed. Artificial dyes, the subject is distributed, but not the minor term. So, the conclusion is saying, claiming more about this minor term, but the premise is talking about only some and not all of the minor term. So it is committing the fallacy of illicit minor. Here is a chart which will help you remember the rules and the associated fallacies. Avoid four terms will be the fallacy of four terms. Distribute the middle term in at least one premise. This is the rule. If broken, the fallacy will be the fallacy of undistributed middle. The third is any term distributed in the conclusion must be distributed in the premises. If broken, it leads to the fallacy of illicit process of the major term. This is illicit major, or the illicit process of the minor term, which will be illicit minor. Rule 4, avoid two negative premises, which will lead to the fallacy of exclusive premises. Number 5, if either premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative. If broken, it leads to the fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise. And the sixth one is the existential fallacy, which is committed if broken this rule, that is no particular conclusion, that is I or O, must be derived from two universal premises which can be either A or E. Problem number 9. No coal tar derivatives are nourishing foods because no coal tar derivatives are natural grain products and all natural grain products are nourishing foods. In the syllogism that is formed, the conclusion is no coal tar derivatives are nourishing foods. So the major term is nourishing foods. Therefore, the major premise will be all natural grain products are nourishing foods. Nourishing foods appears in the predicate position of the major premise. Hence, it is not distributed because this is an A proposition. Therefore, we can say that this syllogism of the form AEE1 commits the fallacy of illicit major term, which is illicit major. Problem number 10. All people who live in London are people who drink tea, and all people who drink tea are people who like it. We may conclude then that all people who live in London are people who like it. So the syllogism which is formed is all people who drink tea are people who like it. All people who live in London are people who drink tea. And the conclusion, all people who live in London are people who like it. This syllogism commits the fallacy of 4 terms because in the conclusion, the major term is people who like it. Okay, so here liking is what is being liked. Living in London, here it is a matter of choice. Okay, likings, that is, I like to live in a certain place and I like to drink tea. These are two different meanings. These are not exactly the same. You don't like to eat something in the same way you like to stay somewhere. Okay, so here there is an equivocation of the term people who like it. Therefore, it has a different meaning in the conclusion and it has a different meaning in the premise. That is the major premise. All people who drink tea are people who like it. So we can say that this syllogism, because of equivocation of the major term, which is people who like it, it breaks rule number 1 and commits the fallacy of 4 terms. So that's all for now. I hope you have understood the 6 rules and how to identify the fallacies step by step. In the next video, we are going to enter chapter number 7, Arguments in Ordinary Language. And from that chapter, we are going to cover this portion which comprises of translations, translating categorical propositions into standard form. So that's all for now. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.